Okay, so I've got some real human brains here, actually, that were donated. These were from local Portland area residents who, donated their organs, including, in this case, the brains. We have, for example, you can see rather dramatically the first of the meninges right here. This is that Dura Mater. I'm going to actually show this a little closer here so you can really get a sense of how, thick and, tough, the tough mother, actually happens to be, right? And then below it, we've got, the arachnoid will have sort of collapsed because the fluid is gone. But you can sort of see here is the frontal lobe, right? This is the most rostral. I should get down in here, I guess. The most rostral or anterior portion of the brain. Here is the most caudal, the occipital lobe, right? And here is the most ventral lobe, is the temporal lobe right here, right? And then I've got this lateral fissure that you can see right along here. It's a little hard to separate because there's a cut from where they cut the dura. They kind of cut along there when they were trying to, basically, reveal some of the underlying cortex there, but leave some of the dura. And I just want to show you, this is such a well-preserved specimen here. You can sort of see, the gyri, those are those surface regions of cortex, the sulci, the valleys that go down below, for example. And you can see some of the vasculature, because what they did was they pumped in acrylic paint actually into the, jugular vein. That's where you see this blue. And then they also have, some of the vessels are arteries, and they pumped into the common carotids, sort of a red acrylic paint. And right along, if you follow this vessel right here, this right here is actually the sulcus, the central sulcus, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And then there's the parietal lobe back to the occipital lobe. And again, the sylvian or the lateral fissure separates the parietal and the frontal lobe, from the ventral temporal lobe right here. And in through that lateral fissure, you'd actually get to the insular lobe, which is sort of much more medial, within that lateral fissure. And now the frontal lobe, is really critically important for social decision making. A good part of what the frontal lobe does is it, receives lots of information, from more posterior areas, networks that are involved in sort of perceptual processing, a lot of subcortical contributions, including, for example, dopaminergic projections from the VTA, right? So some of those, mesocortical projections that signal, aspects of the environment stimuli that are predictive of potential reward, for example. And it develops networks that, allow for sort of consideration of potential consequences, and then, inhibition, of inappropriate, maybe social responses under certain circumstances. So what's interesting about the frontal lobe networks is that they are not, isolated. They're linked up, networked to other regions of the brain, including that far more medial insular lobe. The insula receives lots of visceral input, so lots of information about the gut and, how the tension in your muscles and, whether you're injured, whether you got to go to the bathroom, like all these kinds of, visceral sensations and emotionally salient inputs, and maps that. And then there's a lot of feed forward, a lot of, feed forward and feedback, a lot of talking between the insula and the frontal lobe. So when you think about, making a decision, like, should I get this card for this person's birthday or something? And you have a, oh, no, kind of response, or you have a, oh, yes, kind of response. This allows you to sort of consider, play out, and, determine potential social consequences and make social decisions. One of the things about frontal lobe networks is that they have to develop with social experience. You can't, we don't know how to behave or how to respond or what, the consequences are until we actually, start to, significantly experience them. This is another brain right here, another brain model, and I'm going to take this up here from too. So here's the frontal lobe of this individual too. And you can see parts of the dura, kind of sticking out, from the front, between the two hemispheres there. So the other really key, okay, so another sort of key aspect of frontal lobe function is motor output, is sort of movement. And actually, if I pull this back up again, pull up the dura, and you can see right along here, it's actually one of the veins is right along the central sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the more, anterior parietal lobe. This sulcus, or sorry, this gyrus right here, the pre-central gyrus, this is the one right before the central valley or central sulcus. There is a mapping of the opposite side of the body in terms of motor output. It's actually a very interesting map. It's called sort of a homunculus map, a homuncular map, because there's a great exaggeration of the hand region, for example, all the fingers, and of the face, and there's far less cortical, circuitry devoted to, for example, the back or the legs. So really, it's a reflection of fine sort of voluntary motor control over basically the opposite, or what they call the contralateral, the opposite side of the body. There's a precentral gyrus, a motor strip, with that homuncular mapping on both the left frontal lobe and also on the right frontal lobe. So frontal lobe, I want you to remember, is really critically important for social decision making, for inhibition of inappropriate sort of social decisions, and for the motor aspects of any sort of complex cognitive ability. For example, like with language, the areas that are going to be involved in speech or sign or writing expression are going to be, really importantly dependent on networks that are found in the frontal lobe. Now, as we move more posterior, right, and we cross the central sulcus, there is another gyrus. It's called the post-central gyrus. And the post-central gyrus has an analogous sort of map of the opposite or contralateral, the opposite side of the body. But this map is based on sort of some what we call somatosensory inputs. Somato means body, so sensory inputs from the body, but not the viscerosensitive, or sensory, aspects. Not primarily anyway. The nociceptive, which is the injury sensors, or the temperature sense, etc. The parietal lobe and that post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe is really a map of the opposite side of the body in terms of body position. So it's in terms of what you're touching and how extended your limbs are. So if you close your eyes and you try to touch your nose, which I shouldn't do now because it's got some, fluid on it, you actually have a sense of where your body is arrayed and oriented in space. And that's because you have specialized what are called proprioceptors. These are sensory neurons that are in the joints and connecting tendons to muscle and things like that. So the parietal lobe is really important for mapping where your body is currently arrayed in space. Remember, the most caudal or posterior lobe is the occipital lobe, right back here. And this is primarily concerned with visual input. Visual input from the eye is going to arrive in the occipital lobe, but then it will be shared, more anteriorly, more rostrally, including the sort of dorsal, stream into the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe will integrate, touch, location, spatial mapping of where your body, the felt position of your body is, with visual information about where your body is in relationship to other objects and events. So it's really critically important, the parietal lobe, for mapping, the location of your body in spatial relation to things that are all around you. It's fascinating because people sometimes have migraines that are centered over parietal regions, where they can have disruption of normal activity of networks in the parietal lobe, that normal integration of visual and somatosensory, position sense. And they report sometimes what are known as Alice in Wonderland syndromes, where if you remember, Alice fell down the hole and she said, "Eat me and drink me." And, you know, you can sometimes feel like you're getting very large, right? And everything else is getting very small and far away. Or you're getting very small and everything else is getting larger. So there's disruptions in that spatial mapping if there's, you know, disruptions of normal activity in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe, remember, again, is critical for vision. And then the temporal lobe, you know, receives another great stream. We call this the ventral stream of visual information about what it is you happen to be looking at. So we sometimes call that the what pathway. So the temporal lobe is critically involved in recognizing objects like faces or brains or, you know, rubber gloves and things like that. So the temporal lobe also receives sensory information from the ears, so auditory information. So primary auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe. There are some really important, you know, areas that are involved in language comprehension and language processing that are localized in the left temporal lobe. And then also in the medial temporal lobe, so towards the middle of the temporal lobe, and I can turn the brain over a little bit here. So these areas along, whoops, my fingers are being in the way, along here and along here. This is called the medial temporal lobe. It includes a structure called the hippocampus, which is an old cortical, you know, region, layered region that's critically important for memory function. So the medial temporal lobe is, you'll often hear the MTL is super important for, you know, memory function, particularly sort of episodic memory or explicit memory or, you know, declarative memory, memory for facts, events, and particular specific episodes, you know, that have occurred in your life. So, you know, really interesting, you know, very brief tour of some of the lobes of the brain. And I'll keep these out because we'll talk about some other structures here in a minute as well.